How can I open the Prakhar, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Yes.
Good evening.
Welcome, Principal Ma'am. Welcome, Jyoti Ma'am. Welcome, everyone. Prakhar, I request you to start the session.
Sure, thank you so much, ma'am. The clock has already ticked 5, and yes, I think we should get going. So, greetings and a very thoughtful evening to one and all present. I, Prakhar Srivastav, on behalf of Bharati Vidyapeeth, deemed to be University's New Law College, Pune, welcome you all to a very special discourse on the role of the United Nations in world affairs being organized by the Legal Research Center of New Law College. Bharati Vidyapeeth's New Law College, established in 1978, is a premier institute of international excellence in the field of legal education. Our legal research and legal aid centers have both been actively involved in spreading legal education to the masses, and today's webinar is in fact a step in the same direction. We are honored to have with us today Honorable Mr. Curtis J. Reynolds, Global Affairs expert and former Secretary of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters at New York, the United States. Thank you so much for joining us indeed, sir. We are also thrilled to have been joined by Dr. Bhagishri Deshpande, in charge principal, New Law College, Pune. Also joining us are Dr. Sagar Shelke and Dr. Sapna Deo, assistant professors and heads of the Legal Research and Legal Aid Centers of New Law College, Pune. We are also happy to be joined by Mrs. Rashmi Dubey, Assistant Professor and Faculty Coordinator, Legal Aid and Legal Research Center of New Law College, Pune. I welcome you all to this very special discourse. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Bhagishri Deshpande, in charge principal, New Law College, Pune, to kindly give away the welcome address. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Prakhar. A very good evening to all. A gigantic visionary, Honorable Dr. Patangrao Kadam had established the Bharati Vidyapeeth with the foundations of social transformation through dynamic education. Today, the arch of Bharati Vidyapeeth has been taken to soaring heights by our beloved Chancellor, Honorable Dr. Shivaji Rao Kadam, and our dynamic Pro-Vice Chancellor and Secretary, Honorable Dr. Vishwajit Kadam, who is also the Minister of Maharashtra State for Social Justice. Bharati Vidyapeeth, deemed to be university, is a university of repute and has got very unique aspects. It has been ranked 63rd by the NRF. The New Law College, Bharati Vidyapeeth, is a college of repute and is known for excellence and innovative ideas. It is consistently ranked among the top 10 law colleges of India. The law college has got various cells which function for the practical application of the various issues. We have our environment cell, which deals with the aspects of environment laws and the environment protection. The center has conducted various surveys and various events to promote the environment protection. We also have a legal aid center, which has secured the best legal aid award through of knowledge and Cits last year. This year, we have opened up another cell of artificial intelligence, which is dealing with the issues of the applicability of artificial intelligence in the legal sphere. We also have the Moot Court Society, wherein our students have won many trophies of Moot Court, such as Best Speaker and the Best Team, etc. Today, we have this particular webinar regarding the United States and its functions by the very eminent speaker of today. I'm sure the students are going to profit by this particular webinar. So I hand over to Prakhar for the course of this webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us and giving away the welcome address. And students are very excited for this particular webinar. We are already seeing a lot of students join us on a YouTube stream, where from the students will also be posting their questions. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my very great pleasure and a matter of pride for me to be welcoming our guest for the evening, Mr. Curtis J. Reynolds. Mr. Curtis Reynolds is the former Secretary of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters and an independent consultant focused on international development and global security. Prior to his retirement from the United Nations in 2016, he worked for the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs in New York. Recruited by the United Nations as a young professional in 1985, Mr. Reynolds was first assigned to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, Austria, and later the UN Department for Peacekeeping Operations for field mission assignments in Namibia, South Africa, Liberia, the Central African Republic, and Kosovo. Prior to his international engagement, Mr. Reynolds served with the government of St. Lucia in the Ministry of Finance from 1978 to 1981, followed by the St. Lucia Diplomatic Service from 1981 to 1985. Mr. Reynolds earned a master's degree in government from Harvard University, as well as a bachelor's degree in economics and a postgraduate diploma in international relations from the University of the West Indies at its campuses in Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, respectively. I welcome you, Mr. Reynolds, to this very special webinar, and I request you now to please address our very eager participants. Sir, please.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you about the United Nations. I think it's a very fitting time to do so, given that it is now celebrating its 75th anniversary. First of all, I'll begin by talking about what the United Nations is. The United Nations is an international organization founded in 1945 with 50 founding members that include India. It is currently made up of 193 member states. I believe the last member state to join in the past 5 years was the Republic of Kosovo. The mission, mandate, and work of the United Nations are guided by the purposes and principles contained in its founding charter. Due to the powers vested in its charter and its unique international character, the United Nations can take action on a wide range of issues confronting humanity in the 21st century. These issues can include peace and security, climate change, sustainable development, human rights, disarmament, terrorism, humanitarian and health emergencies, gender equality, governance, food production, and many more areas. Personally, I've worked at the UN in primarily disarmament, peace and security, peacekeeping as a civilian, governance, and my first assignment was in the area of drugs and crime. The United Nations has intervened in many countries around the world, which includes Palestine, South Sudan, Syria, Haiti, Kosovo, Rwanda, Mali, Liberia, the Central African Republic, Cambodia, and many others. As many of you know, the United Nations was involved with the Kashmir issue in India from the very beginning. Most importantly, the UN also provides a forum for its members to express their views in the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, and other bodies and committees. Apart from peacekeeping, the role of the UN as an international forum is what the UN is best known for. By enabling dialogue between its member states and by hosting negotiations, the organization has become a mechanism for governments to find areas of agreement and to solve problems together. The UN's chief administrative officer is the Secretary General. He is currently Mr. Antonio Guterres of Portugal. During my 31 years at the UN, I served under three Secretaries General. That would be Perez de Cuellar, Boutros Ghali, Mr. Kofi Annan, and the fourth one was Mr. Ban Ki-moon. When I transferred to New York, I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Ban Ki-moon and Mr. Kofi Annan on several occasions during the course of my work. 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and I think it's very fitting that your university has chosen to invite me to speak about the work of the UN. The main organs of the UN are as follows: the General Assembly, which consists of all member states, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, and finally, the United Nations Secretariat. The United Nations Secretariat is probably the one that is of most interest because that's where the career officers work. It's also the seat of the Office of Legal Affairs, which is probably the most interesting part of the UN for all of you. As I mentioned before, I worked in the United Nations for 31 years. I joined as a young professional in 1985 from my country diplomatic service, that is the Diplomatic Service of St. Lucia. I know that many of you are eager to hear something about the opportunities for careers at the UN. First of all, the UN is divided, the staff members are divided into two categories. That's the general service staff, that would be the clerical workers and assistants. And in former years, you'd call a lot of them would be secretaries. And then you have the professional category, where you have a large cadre of political analysts, lawyers, economists, and a wide range of other professionals. So the opportunities for working at the UN include jobs in both the general service and professional category. As lawyers, I would expect that you would work primarily in the professional category as legal affairs officers. You could also work in other areas like in consulting, the Office of Legal Affairs, human rights, staff legal assistance, and many other areas. One of the beautiful things about being a lawyer is that you can work in almost any office in the United Nations. Almost every office, because of the nature of the work, it's based on many rules and regulations. It's based on the UN Charter, and also the United Nations. The United Nations is the repository for many, many treaties, international treaties. There's always a need for a lawyer. So even if you don't work in the Office of Legal Affairs, where most of the practicing lawyers work, you can find opportunities in every other area, from human resources to disarmament, political affairs, humanitarian affairs, and like I said, almost any area of the work of the United Nations. Since you are lawyers, I'll focus a little bit on the Office of Legal Affairs. That office consists of the Office of the Legal Counsel, the Office of the Under-Secretary General, the unit that takes care of the law of the sea. You have the General Legal Office, and a number of other areas. Probably the most interesting ones for you would be the law of the sea and the office of the general legal, the general legal office would be the office that deals with almost everything under the sun that the United Nations handles on a more general, generic level. For example, procurement. The United Nations every single day signs hundreds of contracts with contractors to supply the United Nations with equipment needed for peacekeeping missions and for the general running of the UN. The Office of Legal Affairs also advises the Secretary General on a number of legal issues affecting the United Nations. For example, when there's an issue of the recognition of a particular state, sometimes it comes up in the General Assembly, and the office of the legal experts at the Office of Legal Affairs are called upon to adjudicate and to advise the Secretary General. For example, in the past 75 years, there have been a couple of instances where there's been a coup in a particular country, and a delegation would show up at the United Nations, and the questions of whether the government is recognized internationally will come up, and that is an issue that the Office of Legal Affairs would be called upon to advise the Secretary General. Now, whether you are a lawyer or a translator or an economist or a political scientist like I was, there's a certain amount of preparation one needs to be considering when you are contemplating a career with the United Nations. For example, one of the most important things you need to do is to familiarize yourself to a high degree of proficiency in at least two, I would say a minimum of two of the official languages of the United Nations. The United Nations has 6 official languages: English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. English, French, and Spanish are the working languages of the UN, but you also need to use the other 3. I mentioned this because it's very important. There are certain jobs in the UN, whether they be legal or political or economic, that you must meet the mandatory language requirements. For example, if you're going to work in the Africa division, Africa 1 division focuses on West Africa. Many West African countries are French speaking, so you have to have proficiency in French. If you were to apply for a job and you didn't have the mandatory language of French, you would be immediately eliminated from consideration. So it's always good to know more than one language. You should have good command of English and proficiency in another language like French. The more languages you can master, the better. In order to be comfortable in the UN, some of the personal characteristics you need to have, you have to be someone who is fairly comfortable with diversity, That means you can get along with people from all corners of the world, and you are adept at dealing with people of many different cultures. One of the most beautiful things about the UN for me is that even I traveled to many countries around the world in the course of my work, but even the countries I never visited, I got to know those countries very well by just having colleagues around me who came from those countries. For example, one of my best friends when I used to work at the United Nations, he came from Qatar. I know a lot about Qatar, although I've never visited the country. And it was, I had the opportunity to visit and work. For example, see from my resume that I worked in Kosovo. That was one of the most interesting parts of my career. It was part of my career that touched where I had to apply every single thing I learned from school, from primary school until graduate school at university. Every single skill I acquired, I had to apply in Kosovo. As you know, it was a peacekeeping mission which was put in place after the war in Yugoslavia in 1999, following the adoption by the Security Council of Security Council 1244. Excuse me. I hope the information I've given you has been interesting, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I also hope that you have read my recent journal article on the legacy of the seventh Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kofi Annan. It was published in the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy in September 2020. So if you have any questions on what I've just spoken about or on my article, I would welcome them. At this point, I will stop for questions for Q&A.
Yes. So, in fact, while the YouTube stream is underway, sir, and there are questions that are floating in, there are some questions that had come to us earlier as well through the Google form, and some of them are listed with me. And there are some questions that I myself have, and I'm sure all of the attendees also would be having a few of them. So let's start with some of them, sir. So there is somebody named Pratik who has asked a question, sir, and that is this, that what are your views on quote unquote the hegemony of some states in the Security Council of the United Nations, and how do you view the permanent temporary arrangement within the structure of the United Nations Security Council, sir?
Well, that's a very good question. It's something which has been bothering international affairs professionals like myself for a long time. There's a lot of talk about the reform of the United Nations and primarily the Security Council. At this time, the Security Council consists of 15 member states. 5 of them are permanent, so that's what would account for the hegemony, I would imagine. And there are 10 others. This structure was put in place after World War II, and the major players got to single out the most influential positions for themselves, and they remain so at this time. Some of the members, the permanent member states, which we call the P5, they wield a lot of power and influence. Some of them are not not exactly major powers anymore, but I think the international landscape has changed very much over the past 75 years, and I think it is time to introduce and expand the United Nations Security Council. There are currently 10 member states who the non-permanent members who come in from time to time. India being one of those countries. I believe India has been a member of the Security Council, has sat on the Security Council for a total of 16 years in 8 different sessions over the past 75 years. I come from a little island in the Caribbean, St. Lucia. We've never sat on the Security Council, but one of our neighboring islands, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, recently took up the position, a seat on the Security Council. While this is good that you have opportunities, my personal opinion is that you should open up you should expand the number of permanent members. I know that there are moves to include India, Brazil, Japan, and a couple of other, Germany, and a couple of other countries in that group. I think it would bring greater diversities of culture, diversities of history, all of which would contribute to making the decisions at the Security Council much more inclusive. The Security Council, for example, in the first half of the existence of the United Nations until the end of the Cold War in about 1989, 1990, the work of the Security Council was more or less hampered by what you'd call the hegemony and the influence of the more powerful member countries. For example, the divisions between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time were very deep and led to many deadlocks in the Security Council. And for most of the half of its existence, the United Nations Security Council has been fairly ineffective. Since 1989, things have gotten a little bit better, but not up to the extent that one would like to see. So back to your question, I definitely think there's room for much improvement in reform at the United Nations, especially in the area of the composition of the Security Council.
All right, thank you so much, sir. So essentially, there is in fact need to expand the Security Council, is what you're saying. There is one question that has come from one Ms. Shivani, sir, and she's asking that the United Nations has come up with sustainable development goals that are sought to be achieved in a certain duration of time. But then, if we look at the global picture, the situation with regard to climate, with regard to development as it is happening, doesn't really seem to be very rosy. And the sustainable development goals such as the SDG 13 doesn't really seem to be materialized in the time so far, because we are still seeing the same, or in fact increased rates of carbon emissions, etc. So how do you look at the sustainable development goals, and how do you weigh the effectiveness of the sustainable development goals? Do you think the world together will be able to meet those sustainable development goals with important and powerful players like the United States of America signing out of the Paris climate deal, for example, sir?
There's no doubt that the sustainable development goals are experiencing some difficulty in their implementation, but that is something that is not very surprising. The sustainable development goals, like any object which has many moving parts, things can always go wrong, and things, it takes time to get things off the ground. Many of the sustainable development goals rely on conditions on the ground in the various member states where the sustainable development goals are most relevant. A lot of it also depends on cooperation between the various member states. I'm glad you mentioned the climate change, because this is something that cannot be addressed by individual countries. It can be addressed in individual countries to a certain extent within their borders, but there must be a high level of cooperation between the 193 member states of the United Nations. As we can all expect, there will be some improvement because with the change of government and the change of the regime in the United States, we expect that the United States will, for example, rejoin the World Health Organization. They will
Yes.
sign up again to the Paris Agreement. So that's a very good sign, which should also see dividends in the area of sustainable the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mhm.
As I said, it's Sustainable Development Goals they are really moving targets. There are a lot of moving pieces, and it is not surprising that things have taken some time to mature. But I feel fairly confident that the world will eventually move in the right direction, and at some point in time we'll be close to achieving most, if not all, of the SDGs.
Absolutely. In fact, as global citizens, that is something all of us would want to see in the time to come, sir. There is, in fact, another question, and that deals with the opportunities that the United Nations offers to youngsters. And this question comes from Akshat. He's asking, what are some of the important areas in which we can see openings for youngsters, especially members of the legal profession? Because most of the students who have joined us are from the legal profession. So this question is essentially asking what are some of the opportunities, both at local levels and at international levels, when it comes to youngsters, and how can they actually become a part of the larger scheme of things within the United Nations, and how can they contribute to the working of the United Nations? So,
Thank
um, I'm afraid we can't hear you, sir. It's probably due to some technical glitch. We'll try and connect with sir in just a while from now. Yes, so sir, we had lost you before. We were not able to hear you, but yeah, now you seem to be back. So yes,
Okay.
the question dealing with opportunities for youngsters.
Okay. Well, there are many opportunities. Well, first of all, one doesn't necessarily have to join the United Nations to become involved in the work of the United Nations as a young lawyer or young economist. First of all, the most obvious avenue would be the Indian Diplomatic Service. I believe there are certain exams you take to join the diplomatic service. So that's one area. The Indian Diplomatic Service is fairly extensive. They have embassies all around the world, and also at the United Nations headquarters in Vienna, that is Vienna, Austria, New York, and in Geneva. And these offices work very closely with the UN. And so there is work to be done there. That is at the national level. And of course, you can apply for various positions at the UN. If you are a young professional with 2 years or less experience, one would enter most likely at what they call the P2 level. One of the biggest mistakes young people make when they apply for jobs at the UN is that they often apply at too high a level, and they get rejected. So one can apply for entry level positions. If you are a lawyer, lawyer, just graduate, you're probably in the age range of 25, 26 or so. You'd enter at the P, that is professional grade P2 level. For more people with more experience, you might join at the P3. And if you are very experienced, 15, 20 years experience, you join P4 and P5 levels. But for young lawyers, I would recommend you apply at the P1. Well, they're mostly P2 level positions. For nationals of India, one thing you need to take into consideration is the fact that I believe India is probably close to or has exceeded its quota of professionals at the UN. So it makes it a little bit more difficult for Indian nationals to apply for posts that are subject to geographic representation. By that I mean, let's say the UN has 1,000 professional jobs. They are divided among the 193 member states of the UN in quotas. For example, I think the United States, which has a very large population, like India, they have a pretty large quota of about 500 staff. Surprisingly, the Americans never reached their full quota. I come from a very small island in the Caribbean, St. Lucia. Our quota is about 14 staff. I think at the moment we probably have, as far as I can recall, there's only one. At the time when I retired, there were 2 professionals covering St. Lucia's quota. So every year the United Nations holds exams in various professional fields like legal affairs, economics, political affairs. They hold these exams to recruit young professionals coming from countries that are underrepresented. Since India has already met their quota, as far as I can recall, they have not been invited to take those junior professional exams. But that doesn't mean that there are no opportunities for nationals of India. You can join the UN as a consultant or on temporary working assignments, which are not generally subject to quotas. As you can imagine, India is a very large country, a very populous country, so they have quite a number of professionals working in United Nations offices all over the world. And they do very good service. They are very well educated, and so that will account for the fact that India has at this time reached its quota of professional staff. But as I said, that doesn't mean to say that it's totally closed off. There are many Indian nationals who are recruited into the UN through other avenues. Like I said, for example, short and long-term consultancies.
Right. Very correct, sir. There is one question that's coming in from one Miss Chanchala, and she's asking, sir, that the United Nations, even though has conducted a large number of initiatives in order to achieve equality of the sexes, which is to say that there are in fact programs such as UN Women, and there are Sustainable Development Goals that do talk about equality between men and women. Within the working of the United Nations itself, sir, she argues that there isn't enough equality between men and women. And she points out that even if there seems to be an equal number of women and men working at the lower levels of the United Nations, which is the P1 and P2 levels, there doesn't really seem to be that equality on the top levels of the working of the United Nations. How do you respond to that, sir?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that I'm no longer with the UN, so any views I express are my own personal views. yeah, I don't have an influence there, but when I first joined the UN in 1985, and I guess that was the same situation before that, there the vast majority of people working for the UN were men. There were lots of women too. The UN has introduced a number of measures to increase the gender parity in the UN, and I think they have been making a lot of progress over the past 10 years. There is now a female Deputy Secretary General. Hopefully one day we'll have a female Secretary General. They have been making progress. It has not been as fast as everyone would like, but there has been progress. I have seen it myself. Personally, my personal opinion from having worked in the United Nations is that you find that whenever there's an opportunity, there are opportunities for women to move forward in the United Nations. It's usually people from the industrialized world, like in Europe and North America, they are the ones who are in the best position to take advantage of it. In my personal opinion, I think that they sometimes are able to advance at the expense of men from the developing countries, like where I come from. I fully support the idea that there should be gender parity. I think that when there is a saying that wherever decisions are made, women must be there, and I definitely believe in that. Usually the decisions are of a far better quality when you have more women involved in the policy making. So I would certainly welcome that. But yes, there is still an imbalance at the upper echelons of the UN, but I think they're slowly getting there. Probably not as fast as we would like, but they are getting there.
Yes, definitely. And that's in fact very encouraging. Also, with Kamala Harris becoming the Vice President of the United States of America, another good news really. And we are seeing women reach higher positions in higher offices in the US and of course in the United Nations and the world over. There is one more question that's coming in, and this is from one Mr. Ketan sir, and he's asking that the role of the United Nations in management of crisis is in fact appreciated. However, the role of the United Nations in preventing conflicts from happening in the first place is something he seems to be skeptical about. He's saying that the United Nations hasn't really been able to prevent a lot of conflicts from happening between countries, whether it be armed conflicts or conflicts that are not armed, different sort of issues that have been arising within countries. He argues that UN probably, in his assessment, has not been able to do enough to prevent those crises from happening in the first place. What is your take on the same, sir?
Well, hopefully most of you have had a chance to read my journal article that I referred to earlier on. And you will see my reference to the legacy and career of the 7th Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan. In that paper, I focus on the role of the Secretary General of the United Nations. It's the Secretary General of the United Nations, and by extension, the United Nations is sometimes called upon to solve what you might call impossible problems. But what one must remember is that the United Nations is not a separate body by itself. It consists of 193 member states. I would say about 50 countries have wielded a lot of influence in the UN, and each one of them has their own national interests at heart. And every country, when they come to the table, their national interests or their regional interests often is paramount sometimes to the interest of the world in general. So yes, sometimes the United Nations has been ineffective in preventing conflicts, but it is not the fault of the international civil servants like my former self, or the fault of the Secretary General. For example, one of the cases most cited would be the case in Rwanda. Mr. Kofi Annan's hands, he was not the Secretary General at the time, but he held a very, very senior position in peacekeeping at the time. His hands were basically tied. You will see from my article and from his book that he personally got in touch with about 100 member states of the UN to contribute troops to help prevent the massacre, or what I would call a virtual Holocaust in Rwanda. And he didn't get much help, not even from the United States. So it basically, you have to take into account the interests, the national interests of the various countries involved. For example, if there is a conflict between India and China, you will find that the rest of the United Nations will fall around the two sides in a configuration that reflects their national interests. I only use China and India as a hypothetical, but that's the way it has been working all the time. So that's, in a nutshell, why the United Nations sometimes seems to be ineffective in preventing conflict, but it has also had a number of successes. I spent 2.5 years in Kosovo, and after the Kosovo War, and things have changed a lot for the better in Kosovo as a result of the work of the United Nations, and I'm also proud of the work I did there. So it's not all doom and gloom. There have been successes, but there's also been some share of failure on the part of the UN.
Absolutely, Mr. Reynolds. It is very correct that the UN has in fact played a very instrumental role when it comes to unifying the world. In fact, in battling a large number of issues, and as we were discussing, terrorism being one of them, and climate change being another issue. So, in fact, the UN has done a tremendous job when it comes to some of these areas, and the world is in fact thankful to the United Nations for having done that. Like you correctly pointed out, there are a fair share of issues that the UN is battling, but we are certain that we're going to come through. And I'm sure that the United Nations will, of course, with the support of all of the countries and youngsters such as myself and others, will grow to become an institution and organization of much more meaning. So thank you so much, Mr. Curtis Reynolds, for answering all of those questions. I'm sure the participants are returning richer in terms of understanding the working of the United Nations. And of course, with all of their doubts answered, I'm sure there is a tad more clarity on the functioning of the United Nations. So thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I'd now like to call upon Skand Bajpayee, my very able colleague, to kindly deliver the vote of thanks. Skand, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure and honor to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every individual tired working for the success of this event. Firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Curtis J. Reynolds, Global Affairs expert and former Secretary of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. who, in spite of having a very busy schedule, is here today to enlighten us upon the role of United Nations in world affairs. I extend my heartiest gratitude towards our beloved Principal Madam, Dr. Bhagyashree Deshpande, without whose able guidance and constant supervision, this event would not have been such a great success. I feel deeply indebted by the constant supervision and mentoring provided by our learned professors, Sagar Shelke, Dr. Sapna Dev, and Ms. Rashmi Dubey, who have been tirelessly working and have also been taking a lot of pain for putting up this event. I would like to extend my heartiest gratitude towards three of my most inspiring seniors, Mr. Anul Goyal, Mr. Simarjit Singh Setia, and Mr. Prakhar Srivastav, who have strived to put up this event and maintain its momentum. Lastly, I thank all the viewers who have tuned into this webinar and have made its goal achieved.
Thank you so much, Skand, for delivering the vote of thanks there. Thanks a lot indeed. And thank you, Mr. Renard, once again. And thank you to all the faculty members, Madam Principal, and of course, all the attendees for joining us today for this very, very special webinar. On that note, we'll call it a day on this webinar. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.